The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Salem Falls like the whispers of forgotten prayers, and Sarah McKenna walked through it with the same grace she had inherited from her grandmother, a grace that would soon be mistaken for something far more sinister. Her leather satchel bounced gently against her hip, filled with herbs that carried the scent of hope and healing, though she had no way of knowing that this particular morning would mark the beginning of her greatest trial. The Hartwell cottage stood at the edge of town, where civilization met the wild embrace of the Massachusetts forest. Inside, little Emma Hartwell lay dying, her small chest barely rising and falling with each labored breath. Dr. Benjamin Hayes had already pronounced his verdict with the cold finality that only medical men of 1847 possessed. The child would not see another sunset. Her parents, Thomas and Mary Hartwell, had sent word to Sarah in desperation, though they knew the whispers that followed her through the streets like shadows. Sarah knelt beside the bed, her hands moving with practiced certainty as she prepared a mixture of willow bark and elderflower. The child's fever burned like a furnace, and her lips had taken on the bluish tint that spoke of a soul preparing to depart. But Sarah had seen this before, had felt the pulse of life fighting against the tide of death, and she knew that sometimes the old ways could reach places where modern medicine failed. "Please," Mary Hartwell whispered, her voice breaking like autumn leaves, "please save her. She's all we have left." Sarah's fingers found the child's wrist, feeling for the thread of life that still connected Emma to this world. Her grandmother had taught her to listen with more than her ears, to see with more than her eyes. The gift had been passed down through generations of women who understood that healing came not from books or instruments, but from the deep well of compassion that connected all living things. As she worked, Sarah felt the familiar warmth spreading through her hands, the sensation that had frightened her as a child but now brought her purpose. She had learned to trust this feeling even when she couldn't explain it to others. The herbs helped, certainly, but there was something more, something that flowed through her like sunlight through stained glass, transforming ordinary touch into something extraordinary. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the child's labored breathing and the soft murmur of Sarah's voice as she sang an old lullaby her grandmother had taught her. The words were in a language that predated the English settlement, syllables that seemed to dance in the air like fireflies. She pressed her palms against Emma's forehead, feeling the heat begin to recede like a tide pulling back from shore. The change came gradually, then all at once. Emma's breathing deepened, her color returned, and her eyes fluttered open with the bright clarity of a child who had been sleeping peacefully rather than dancing at death's door. Mary Hartwell fell to her knees beside the bed, tears streaming down her face as she gathered her daughter into her arms. "She's well," Sarah said quietly, packing her herbs back into her satchel. "The fever has broken. She'll need rest and plenty of fluids, but she'll recover completely." But even as relief flooded the cottage, Sarah felt the first stirrings of unease. Through the window, she could see faces pressed against the glass, neighbors who had gathered to witness what they expected to be a death, now staring in stunned silence at a miracle they couldn't understand. In their eyes, she saw something that made her blood run cold: fear. Judge Cornelius Blackwood stood among them, his austere frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the morning light. His eyes were the color of winter storms, and they fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She had heard the stories about the judge, how he had presided over the witch trials in neighboring towns, how he believed that the devil's influence was spreading through Massachusetts like a plague. Witchcraft, the word hissed through the crowd like a serpent's whisper. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that her greatest gift had just become her greatest curse. In saving Emma Hartwell's life, she had sealed her own fate. The very miracle that should have been celebrated would instead be twisted into evidence of her damnation. Judge Blackwood stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of divine judgment. Sarah McKenna, by the power vested in me by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and by God Almighty, I place you under arrest for the practice of witchcraft and congress with the devil. You will be held until such time as a proper tribunal can be convened to determine your guilt or innocence." The words echoed through the cottage like a death knell, and Sarah felt the world tilt on its axis. She had spent her life healing others, following the path of compassion her grandmother had taught her. Now, that same compassion would be used to destroy her. As rough hands seized her arms and iron shackles clicked around her wrists, Sarah caught one last glimpse of little Emma Hartwell, alive and well, watching with wide, frightened eyes as her savior was dragged away in chains. The bells of Salem Falls First Congregational Church rang out their solemn call to morning prayer, but Reverend Jonathan Whitmore found no peace in their familiar chime. He stood at his study window, watching the commotion unfold in the town square below, his heart heavy with a burden he had never expected to carry. The sight of Sarah McKenna being led away in chains had struck him like a physical blow, awakening something in his soul that he had thought long dormant. Jonathan had arrived in Salem Falls only 3 months prior, sent by the church hierarchy to restore order to a congregation that had grown restless under their previous minister's fire and brimstone approach. At 32, he was considered young for such a position, but his reputation for thoughtful sermons and progressive theology had preceded him. He believed in a God of love rather than wrath, in redemption rather than damnation. These beliefs, he was beginning to realize, would soon be put to their ultimate test. He had first encountered Sarah McKenna at the widow Morrison's bedside, where she had been tending to the elderly woman's infected wound with gentle competence. What had struck him then was not her beauty, though she possessed a quiet grace that seemed to illuminate whatever room she entered, but rather the profound compassion in her eyes. She had looked at the suffering widow with the same love he imagined Christ must have shown to the afflicted, and in that moment, Jonathan had recognized a kindred spirit. "Brother Whitmore," a voice called from behind him. Elder Thomas Grimsby stood in the doorway, his weathered face grave with concern. "Have you heard the news? The McKenna woman has been arrested for witchcraft. Judge Blackwood himself witnessed her unholy practices." Jonathan turned from the window, his jaw tightening. "What practices exactly, Elder Grimsby?" "From what I understand, she healed a dying child. Since when has mercy become a crime?" The older man's eyes narrowed. "Since that mercy comes from congress with the devil rather than prayer to the Almighty. The Hartwell child was beyond saving, Doctor. Hayes himself pronounced her as good as dead. Yet this woman, this witch, brought her back with nothing but herbs and incantations. What would you call that, if not supernatural?" "I would call it a miracle," Jonathan replied quietly. "And I would ask myself whether we should be condemning miracles or celebrating them." Elder Grimsby stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Be careful, Reverend. Your words border on blasphemy. The judge has already expressed concerns about your liberal interpretations of Scripture. Do not give him reason to question your fitness for this position." But Jonathan was no longer listening. Through the window, he could see the crowd gathering around the courthouse, their faces twisted with the kind of righteous fury that had once driven Christ from the temple. He thought of Sarah's gentle hands tending to the sick, of the way she had hummed softly to comfort a frightened child, of the tears he had seen her shed over those she couldn't save. This was not the work of evil, but of profound good. The decision crystallized in his mind like ice forming on a winter pond, sudden, complete, and unbreakable. He would not stand by and watch injustice masquerade as righteousness. He would not allow fear to triumph over love, no matter the cost to himself. "I must go," he said, moving toward the door with newfound purpose. "Go where?" Elder Grimsby demanded. "To see Judge Blackwood, to offer my testimony on behalf of Miss McKenna." The elder's face paled. "You cannot be serious. You would risk everything for a woman you barely know? A woman accused of witchcraft?" Jonathan paused at the threshold, his hand on the door handle. Elder Grimsby, I have spent my life studying the teachings of Christ. I have read of his compassion for the outcast, his defense of the accused, his willingness to stand against the powerful on behalf of the powerless. If I cannot find the courage to follow his example now, then what good have all my years of study been? The walk to the courthouse felt like a journey through a world gone mad. Neighbors who had once greeted him with warm smiles now watched him with suspicion. Children who had run to him for blessings now hid behind their mothers' skirts. The very air seemed charged with an electric tension that made his skin crawl. Judge Blackwood received him in his chambers, a room that seemed designed to intimidate, with its dark wood paneling and stern portraits of long-dead magistrates. The judge himself was a man who wore authority like armor, his steel-gray hair pulled back severely and his eyes as cold as winter stones. "Reverend Whitmore," Blackwood said without preamble, "I trust you have come to offer your support in this matter of Sarah McKenna's arrest. Your congregation needs to see that their spiritual leader stands firmly against the forces of darkness." Jonathan felt his heart pounding against his ribs, but his voice remained steady. "I have come to offer my testimony, Judge Blackwood, but not in the way you might expect. I believe Miss McKenna is innocent of the charges against her. I believe she is a woman of profound faith and goodness, and I intend to speak in her defense." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Blackwood's face remained impassive, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "I see," he said finally. "And you base this belief on what evidence exactly?" "On the evidence of her character, her actions, and her heart. I have seen her tend to the sick with nothing but love and compassion. I have watched her weep over those she couldn't save. This is not the behavior of someone in league with evil, but of someone touched by divine grace." Judge Blackwood rose slowly from his chair, his presence filling the room like a gathering storm. "Reverend Whitmore, you are either very brave or very foolish, perhaps both, but I will give you one chance to reconsider your position. Walk away now, and we will speak no more of this conversation. Continue on this path, and I fear you will find yourself standing trial alongside the witch you seek to defend." Jonathan met the judge's gaze without flinching. "Then, so be it. If defending innocence makes me a criminal, then I will wear that label with pride." The Salem Falls courthouse had been transformed into a theater of judgment, its normally quiet chambers now echoing with the murmur of an expectant crowd. Sarah McKenna sat in the prisoner's dock, her wrists bound with iron shackles that had left angry red marks on her pale skin. The chains clinked with every small movement, a metallic reminder of how quickly her world had crumbled from healer to heretic. 3 days had passed since her arrest, 3 days of confinement in a cell that reeked of fear and desperation. She had been given little food and less water, a calculated cruelty designed to break her spirit before the trial even began. But despite her physical weakness, Sarah's mind remained sharp, her heart still clinging to the belief that truth would somehow prevail over superstition. Judge Blackwood presided over the proceedings with the cold authority of a man who had already reached his verdict. His gavel struck the wooden bench with the finality of a funeral bell, calling the tribunal to order. The courtroom fell silent, save for the nervous shuffling of feet and the occasional whispered prayer from the gallery. "Sarah McKenna," the judge's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "You stand accused of practicing witchcraft, of communing with the devil, and of using supernatural powers to deceive and corrupt the good people of Salem Falls. How do you answer these charges?" Sarah lifted her head with what dignity she could muster, her voice steady despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. "I am innocent, Your Honor. I have done nothing but try to heal the sick and comfort the suffering. If that is a crime, then I am guilty only of following the example of Christ himself." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom at her words. Several spectators crossed themselves, while others muttered about blasphemy. Judge Blackwood's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You dare invoke the name of our Savior while standing accused of trafficking with Satan?" he thundered. "Your arrogance knows no bounds, woman." The prosecutor, A thin man named Aldrich, who seemed to wither under the weight of his own righteousness, rose to present his case. "Your Honor, the evidence against the accused is overwhelming. Witness after witness can attest to her unnatural abilities. The Hartwell child was dying. Dr. Hayes himself pronounced her beyond saving. Yet this woman, through means that can only be described as supernatural, brought the child back from death's door. Such power cannot come from God, for God works through his chosen ministers, not through common women who traffic in herbs and incantations." Sarah felt her heart sink as witness after witness took the stand, each one painting her gift as something monstrous and evil. Mrs. Patterson spoke of how Sarah had cured her husband's festering wound with a strange poultice and muttered words in a foreign tongue. Young Timothy Fletcher described how Sarah had once stopped his bleeding with nothing but a touch and a whispered prayer. Each act of healing was twisted into evidence of her corruption, each moment of mercy transformed into proof of her damnation. The testimony that cut deepest came from Rebecca Stone, a woman whose child Sarah had failed to save the previous winter. "She came to my dying boy with her potions and her spells," Rebecca sobbed, her voice breaking with remembered grief. "But when her witchcraft failed, she wept as if she truly cared. It was all an act, a deception to make us trust her. She feeds on our desperation, uses our pain for her own dark purposes." Sarah wanted to cry out, to explain that her tears had been genuine, that she had grieved for every life she couldn't save. But the chains that bound her seemed to bind her voice as well, leaving her trapped in a nightmare of false accusations and twisted truths. It was then that Reverend Jonathan Whitmore rose from the gallery, his presence commanding immediate attention. Sarah's heart leapt at the sight of him, though she feared what his intervention might cost him. "Your Honor," Jonathan's voice rang clear and strong, "I request permission to speak as a character witness for the accused." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Judge Blackwood's face darkened with fury, but he could not deny a man of the cloth his right to testify. "You may speak, Reverend," the judge said through gritted teeth, "but choose your words carefully. The court will not tolerate any attempts to excuse or minimize the serious charges before us." Jonathan stepped forward, his eyes finding Sarah's across the crowded courtroom. In that moment, she saw something that gave her hope. Not just compassion, but a love so pure and strong that it seemed to illuminate the darkness surrounding them. "Your Honor," Jonathan began, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction, "I have known Sarah McKenna for 3 months. In that time, I have watched her tend to the sick with nothing but love and compassion. I have seen her weep over those she couldn't save and rejoice over those she could. If this woman is a witch, then she is a witch who serves the God of love, not the devil of hate." The chains around Sarah's wrists suddenly felt lighter, as if Jonathan's words had the power to break more than just the bonds of iron. For the first time since her arrest, she dared to hope that love might triumph over fear, that truth might prevail over superstition. But as she looked at Judge Blackwood's face, she realized that the real battle was just beginning. The candle in Jonathan's study burned low as he pored over dusty legal volumes and church records, searching for any precedent that might save Sarah's life. The trial had been adjourned until morning, giving him precious little time to find a legal miracle. His testimony had done little more than paint a target on his own back, with Judge Blackwood's threats still echoing in his ears like thunder before a storm. A soft knock at his door interrupted his desperate research. "Doctor." Benjamin Hayes stood in the doorway, his medical bag clutched tightly in his weathered hands. The doctor's face was etched with the kind of torment that came from wrestling with conscience. "Reverend," Dr. Hayes said quietly, glancing nervously over his shoulder, "I need to speak with you about Miss McKenna, about what really happened with the Hartwell child." Jonathan set down his quill, sensing that everything was about to change. "Please, sit. Tell me what's troubling you." The doctor's hands trembled as he settled into the chair across from Jonathan's desk. I lied in my testimony, not outright, but I omitted crucial details. The Hartwell child wasn't dying of any natural illness. She had been poisoned. Poisoned? Jonathan leaned forward, his heart racing. By whom? That's what I've been trying to determine. The symptoms were subtle but unmistakable to a trained eye. Digitalis poisoning, administered in small doses over several days. Someone wanted that child to die slowly, to suffer. Dr. Hayes' voice broke with emotion. Sarah didn't perform witchcraft. She recognized the poisoning and used her knowledge of herbs to counteract it. She saved Emma's life not through supernatural means, but through superior medical knowledge. Jonathan felt the pieces of a terrible puzzle beginning to fall into place. Who else knew the child was poisoned? Before Dr. Hayes could answer, another knock came at the door. This time it was Martha Whitmore, Jonathan's younger sister, her face pale with urgency. Jonathan, you need to hear this. I've been talking to the other women in town, asking questions about Judge Blackwood. What I discovered... She paused, noticing Dr. Hayes. Should I speak freely? Please, Jonathan said. Dr. Hayes is here to help Sarah too. Martha took a shaky breath. Judge Blackwood had a daughter once. 20 years ago, in Connecticut. Her name was Elizabeth, and she was known for her healing abilities with herbs and natural remedies. When a plague swept through their town, she saved dozens of lives using methods very similar to Sarah's. Dr. Hayes straightened in his chair. What happened to her? Blackwood himself accused her of witchcraft. His own daughter. He presided over her trial and sentenced her to death. Martha's voice cracked. She died at the stake, proclaiming her innocence until the very end. The townspeople later realized their mistake when the real source of the plague was discovered, a contaminated well, but it was too late. Jonathan felt his blood run cold. He's seeing his daughter in Sarah. This isn't about justice, it's about his guilt. There's more, Martha continued. I spoke with Mrs. Abernathy, who lived in Connecticut then. She said Judge Blackwood never recovered from what he did. He became obsessed with finding witches, convinced that if he could root out enough evil, somehow he could atone for murdering his own child. He spent 20 years traveling from town to town, leaving a trail of innocent blood behind him. Dr. Hayes stood abruptly, pacing to the window. We have to expose him. We have to tell the truth about what really happened to Emma Hartwell. It won't be enough, Jonathan said grimly. His power in this community is absolute. People fear him more than they love truth. He paused, an idea beginning to form. But there might be another way. What are you thinking? Martha asked. Jonathan pulled out a thick volume of Massachusetts colonial law, his finger tracing down an ancient statute. There's an old law, rarely used but still valid. If a condemned person marries before execution, their spouse can claim them under coverture law. The marriage would legally transfer Sarah from the court's jurisdiction to her husband's protection. Dr. Hayes frowned. But who would marry a woman condemned for witchcraft? And would Judge Blackwood honor such a law? He would have to, Jonathan said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. The law predates his authority, and he's too proud of his legal knowledge to ignore a legitimate statute. As for who would marry her, he looked up at his sister and the doctor, his decision clear in his eyes. I will, Martha gasped. Jonathan, no. You'd be destroying your career, your future, everything you've worked for. What good is a future built on the grave of an innocent woman? Jonathan replied, what value does a career have if I use it to serve injustice rather than fight it? He stood, feeling the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. Sarah McKenna has shown me what true faith looks like. Not the kind that condemns from a comfortable distance, but the kind that kneels in the dirt to heal the suffering. If I can't find the courage to save her, then I'm not worthy to call myself a man of God. Dr. Hayes placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder. The marriage would have to take place before dawn, when the execution is scheduled, and you'd need a witness willing to perform the ceremony. I'll do it, Martha said quietly. I'm not ordained, But the law allows for emergency marriages in extreme circumstances. I'll marry you both if it means saving an innocent life. Jonathan felt a surge of love for his brave sister, but also a deep sadness for what this decision would cost them all. By dawn, they would either save Sarah McKenna or join her in exile from the only community they had ever known. But as he thought of her gentle hands and compassionate heart, he knew there was no choice at all. Love demanded everything, and he was finally ready to give it. The jail cell reeked of despair and dampness, its stone walls slick with moisture that seemed to weep for all the innocent souls who had suffered within them. Sarah sat on the narrow cot, her chains dragging against the floor with every movement, watching through the barred window as the moon traced its final arc across the star-studded sky. Dawn would come soon, and with it, her execution. She had made peace with death hours ago, whispering prayers for forgiveness, not for crimes she hadn't committed, but for the pain her gifts had apparently caused others. If healing the sick made her a witch in their eyes, then perhaps this world was not meant for someone like her. She thought of her grandmother's stories about women who had come before, healers and wise women who had paid the ultimate price for their compassion. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor, accompanied by hushed voices. Sarah expected to see Judge Blackwood, or perhaps the executioner, come to prepare her for the morning's grim ceremony. Instead, Reverend Jonathan Whitmore appeared at her cell door, his face illuminated by the flickering torchlight, accompanied by a guard who seemed nervous about this late-night visit. "Miss McKenna," Jonathan whispered, pressing close to the bars, "I have something to tell you, but you must listen carefully and trust me completely." Sarah rose slowly, her chains clanking as she moved toward him. "Reverend, you shouldn't be here. Your reputation is already compromised because of me. My reputation means nothing if I lose my soul by standing idle while evil triumphs." His hand reached through the bars to touch hers, his fingers warm against her cold skin. "Sarah, there's a way to save you, but it requires an enormous leap of faith from both of us." She searched his eyes in the dim light, seeing something there that made her heart race with emotions she had thought lost forever. "What do you mean?" "There's an old law that allows for emergency marriage before execution. If you marry me at dawn, you'll be transferred from the court's jurisdiction to my protection as your husband. Judge Blackwood would have no choice but to release you." Sarah stared at him in shock, her mind struggling to process what he was suggesting. "Jonathan, you can't sacrifice your entire life for me. Your ministry, your future, everything would be ruined." "My future means nothing without you in it," he said simply, his voice carrying a conviction that took her breath away. "Sarah, I know this isn't how either of us imagined finding love, but I need you to know that this isn't just about saving your life. These past months, watching you heal others, seeing your courage in the face of hatred, you've shown me what true faith looks like. I love you, not as a man loves a cause, but as a man loves a woman." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks, mixing hope with disbelief. "But the town, the church, they'll never accept us. We'd be outcasts." "Then we'll be outcasts together," Jonathan replied, his thumb wiping away her tears through the bars. "I'd rather spend my life as an exile with you than spend it as a respected man without you." The guard shifted uncomfortably behind them, clearly torn between duty and the growing realization that he was witnessing something profound. "Sir, you need to keep your voices down. If Judge Blackwood discovers this plan—" "He won't," Jonathan assured him, then turned back to Sarah. "Martha will perform the ceremony just before dawn in the courtyard outside your cell. Doctor, Hayes will serve as witness. Everything is arranged, but I need to know. Will you marry me, Sarah McKenna?" Sarah felt her heart breaking and mending simultaneously. This man was offering her not just life, but love. A love so pure and selfless that it defied everything she had come to believe about human nature. Through the darkness of her imprisonment, he had become her light. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Yes, Jonathan Whitmore, I will marry you." As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, Sarah realized that her chains, while still binding her body, could no longer touch her soul. Love had already set her free. The first blush of dawn painted the courthouse courtyard in shades of gold and rose, as if heaven itself were blessing the ceremony about to unfold. Sarah stood in her chains before Martha Whitmore, whose hands trembled slightly as she held the worn prayer book that would seal their unconventional union. Jonathan stood beside his bride, his presence radiating a calm strength that seemed to transform the grim setting into something sacred. Dr. Hayes positioned himself as witness, his medical bag at his feet containing the legal documents that would make this marriage binding under Massachusetts law. The same guard who had allowed Jonathan's midnight visit now stood watch, his conscience having finally overcome his fear of Judge Blackwood's wrath. "Dearly beloved," Martha began, her voice growing stronger with each word, "we are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join Jonathan Whitmore and Sarah McKenna in holy matrimony. Though the circumstances are unusual, the love between these two souls is as real and pure as any I have witnessed." Through the courthouse windows, they could see Judge Blackwood and his entourage preparing for the execution, unaware of the ceremony taking place in the shadows. Time was running short, and every moment brought them closer to either salvation or catastrophe. "Jonathan," Martha continued, "do you take Sarah to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Jonathan replied, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Before God and these witnesses, I pledge my life, my love, and my protection to this woman, now and always." "Sarah," Martha turned to the bride, "do you take Jonathan to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying across the courtyard like a prayer answered. "I give you my heart, my soul, and my unwavering devotion." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the courthouse as Judge Blackwood's voice boomed through the corridors, calling for the prisoner to be brought forth. Martha quickly concluded the ceremony, her words racing against time itself. "By the power vested in me by the laws of Massachusetts and by the grace of God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jonathan, you may kiss your bride." As their lips met, the iron shackles around Sarah's wrists seemed to lose their power over her. The kiss was gentle, but filled with the promise of a lifetime together, a defiant act of love in the face of hatred and fear. Judge Blackwood burst into the courtyard, his face contorting with rage, as he realized what had transpired. "What is the meaning of this?" he roared. Dr. Hayes stepped forward, producing the marriage certificate with the flourish of a man who had finally found his courage. "Your Honor, Mrs. Sarah Whitmore is now under the protection of her husband. According to Massachusetts coverture law, you no longer have jurisdiction over her person." The judge's face turned purple with fury, but even he could not argue with the law he claimed to serve. "This is an outrage, a mockery of justice." "No," Jonathan said quietly, taking Sarah's hand in his own. "This is what justice actually looks like. This is love triumphing over fear, truth conquering lies, and mercy defeating cruelty." As the sun rose fully over Salem Falls, casting long shadows across the courtyard, the newlyweds walked hand in hand toward the edge of town. Behind them, they could hear Judge Blackwood's threats and promises of retribution, but ahead lay the open road and the promise of a new life built on the foundation of true love. Sarah's chains had been removed, but more importantly, the chains of fear and superstition that had bound the entire community were beginning to crack. In the days that followed, people would whisper about the minister who had sacrificed everything for love, and some would begin to question whether the real evil lay not in healing hands, but in hearts hardened by hatred. The The couple paused at the town's border, looking back one last time at the place that had tried to destroy them, but had instead forged them into something stronger. Then together they stepped forward into their new dawn, leaving behind the darkness of Salem Falls and walking toward a future written in love rather than fear.